So thank you everyone for being here, including the people online. Today we have the pleasure of welcoming one of our own, André Diamant. You were a McGill 3-pack, right? You did your BSc, your MSc and PhD.
Yeah.
MSc, PhD, all in the MPU program. You graduated in 2020, correct?
That's correct.
Correct. And following your PhD, you have co-founded a startup company called Gray, and you're going to talk to us about it today. So please. Okay. Thanks, Andre.
All right, thank you, Pete. Do I have to turn this on, and this is already on? Seems like it's already on. All right, great. So yeah, I've sort of titled this From Academia to Entrepreneurship and some ramblings along the way. A, because I ramble, and B, because that's effectively what happened. And I figured I'd just talk a little bit about how I got here, some of the learnings along the way as well. Standard disclaimer, obviously, I do now work at a company, and there are going to be bits and pieces of this that are talking about the company. So I figured it would be good to start in terms of the academic journey itself. As Pete nicely pointed out, I started in physics. This initially, the idea, it was actually physics or med school when I was coming out of high school. And, you know, the chips landed one way. I decided to go into physics instead. But throughout that degree, I was fortunate. I did an internship at the NRC, gave me some more, let's say, in-depth experience and perspective on the challenges and problems that are being solved in physics. And I continued to sort of have that urge to apply this to tangible human lives. No disrespect to pure physicists, but I wanted to see how I could have more of a clear impact to society on the medical perspective. And when flipping through the graduate catalog at McGill, I stumbled across medical physics. I had no idea what it was. But it was kind of perfect. So one thing led to another. I ended up joining the MPU in 2014 and very quickly was radicalized towards the concept of precision medicine. And how can we actually treat a patient like an individual rather than sort of one size fits all bags of water? So started to dabble in Bayesian networks, a form of artificial intelligence in that MSc, and then continued that on into the PhD, not going backwards. Where at that point I was kind of full on into the AI realm of what my interests were. And I will get into what that actual degree or thesis was next. So really the motivation, I'm kind of cutting this directly from the PhD thesis itself, was that in order to truly personalize medicine, we have to start with accurate outcome prediction. If we're not doing that, then what are you actually optimizing? Not relevant. Sorry, I just received a call seeing if it was my family. In terms of the hypothesis was that by properly using the vast and diverse information available pre-treatment, one can accurately determine whether a cancer patient is of particularly high or low risk, and thus could warrant a more aggressive and conservative treatment. Of course, this is a very broad statement, but it was what a number of the papers in my PhD focused around. This is a depiction of the very last element of my PhD, which some of you will have seen before, where I effectively would take the CT and the PET of, in this case, a head and neck cancer patient, throw them through a black box, if you will, which included convolutional neural networks, which broke down those images into what I called feature maps, which in some ways is kind of like an analog to radiomics, but not really. The radiomics folks would probably get mad at me for saying that. And then I sprinkled in some clinical inputs like tumor size, age, sex, all that stuff, added some more training layers, and ended up outputting a score, which was essentially what is the risk on these patients that the standard of care would or wouldn't work. This was done retrospectively, so it was on 300 patients or so, that we all received about 60 gray and 30 fractions, again, plus or minus a couple gray. So they all received a standard of care. 20% of them had poor outcomes, and we were able to link with quite good accuracy based on their images, which ones were going to react like that. If I were to continue along the academic path, I was going to flip this on its head, and instead of becoming a retrospective input and then say, okay, the standard of care doesn't work, I was going to use the same type of input to determine what would the ideal treatment actually be. Is there a way that we could craft a treatment plan or craft a care trajectory itself based on those inputs. One question that I've received a number of times is, why not just start that company? Like, how did we end up going in the direction that we did, which I'll get into in a second, and start that? Well, there's a number of reasons. The kind of crux of which is all that it would be incredibly challenging, bordering on impossible to start that type of thing. There's a number of reasons for this. I believe that the ecosystem isn't fully ready for that yet. Physicians and others aren't really ready to have a black or gray, pardon the pun box, tell them what type of treatment would work. It's starting to get there, and in 10 years, I think we'll be in a place where it's more feasible, but you would be fighting uphill. The dollar amount required would be ridiculous to do this. Like, you're talking lots of data science, lots of hurdles, et cetera. The amount of data required would be ridiculous to do this, like you see in dermatology, where there'll be sort of marquee papers that have 10,000 patients, stuff like that. And whenever you need that much data, there's tons of hurdles. Ethics, privacy, your medical device, et cetera, which ties back into the dollars. And there's steep competition from a lot of big fish. Like, this is not necessarily that novel of an idea. So there's a lot of people trying to do this. So instead of that, we kind of took a step back, and ultimately the way that we looked at this was, let's do baby steps towards this kind of larger vision about a healthcare ecosystem with no resource wasted. And resource is a very, very broad term here. At the most sort of high level, holistic point of view, almost, it's the concept of patient's time, staff time, provider resources. But then you can get more granular and look at an individual data point, which ties back to my PhD of how can we really make sure that every piece of information, mathematical or otherwise, that we have can be used to its full potential. I'll get into origins in a few slides as well to show you, but to elaborate a bit more on that, healthcare has a significant amount of waste. This is not rocket science. This is not news to anybody. JAMA article from, I believe it was 2019, just before the pandemic, estimated that there was about $250 billion of annual waste in the US alone due to administrative complexity. And there's a few reasons for that, especially in cancer care. It's more fragmented than ever. You see the various silos that exist, medical oncology, radiation oncology, surgery, arguably being the three biggest. Cancer care is more complex than ever. With how sophisticated treatments are getting, it's great in terms of clinical outcomes, but it does lead to more and more qualifications required, more and more resources, and just coordinating that can be difficult. And then operational resources are more strained than ever. COVID really exacerbated this. And a lot of this can fall directly onto patients through excess delays. Wait rooms are often quite full and waiting. And in the worst case scenario, where you can actually cause medical errors if care needs to be coordinated and then ends up falling through the cracks, or missing appointments, or not booking appointments that need to be concurrent, et cetera. So at the end of the day, there are two major elements that we were looking to address when we decided, okay, we're going to jump into this entrepreneurship lifestyle and try and solve existing pains. And we're not going to be a medical device. We're going to stay away from what I described that I did during my PhD. That's kind of the next step. But instead, we're going to handle these logistics issues and effectively layer on top of the existing legacy software, a lot of which is inadequate for this type of thing. Most of it is billing software. Like, that's its job. That's what it's built to do. It's not built to handle these complex problems. And we do this in two ways. One is within a department. All these departments I described have very diverse sets of challenges. It's kind of this multi-dimensional game of Tetris that they're playing, and tools that don't solve those. They're facing staff shortages and what I call patient inflation, in terms of cancer rates are only going up. And this is just a very simple depiction of fitting patients onto chairs, onto nurses, and juggling all of that, which the infusion center has to do every day. Radiation has their own sets of challenges as well. This increases patient delays. It causes tons of stress when an urgent patient comes up and they look at the schedule and it's entirely full, and what are they going to do about it? You then also have the challenges across departments. Care is very fragmented. Again, none of this is necessarily rocket science here. And care trajectories are very, very complicated. This is, you're not meant to be able to read it, don't worry, but this is just a simple breast cancer trajectory. All of the different colors represent different touch points, whether it's radiology or screening or radiation oncologist or medical oncologist or the surgeon. And coordinating all of this, even when it's under the same roof, can be a big challenge. A quote that we've actually heard a number of times is the one on the bottom right here about, I'm sure that we have the data somewhere, but they can't leverage it and they're operating in the dark. And it's, yes, there is an existing EHR, which is electronic health record, that's holding all of that data, but it's not actually there in a way that's visualizable or actionable in any way. So we set out to bring value along sort of 4 multiple axes: reduce patient delays and just bring those numbers down and treat patients quicker, optimize resource efficiency and make sure that all of the expensive capital, whether it's human resources or chairs or Linux or what have you, is being used, reduce administrative burden, and then improve staff satisfaction, give them a bit more autonomy and remove some of the monotonous tasks that they always deal with. Of course, this is fast forwarding a little bit because we don't necessarily have the time for me to give you the 3-hour backstory of how we really got from there to here. So speeding things up a little, ultimately what we ended on and what we now have and constantly iterating on, we call GreyOS. We think of it, if we're going to get cringy with marketing, as the operating system for oncology. And really the idea is we build a digital model of the hospital, and that includes all of these various silos, whether it's radiation, medical, pharmacy, labs, what have you. And it's connected live with the EHR. So that's where, when I mentioned, it's kind of this logistics layer. And this solves issues along those 2 axes, both within departments. We're delivering fully automated scheduling, a care plan and protocol management tool to help safeguard the clinical knowledge and really streamline care, and then dashboards and analytics because it's 2022. And we'd be remiss if we weren't letting folks very concisely see the various key performance indicators or what matters to them in the moment. And then across departments, because we're looking at a zoomed out view, we're able to help visualize trajectories, regardless of whether they include endoscopy, chemo, radiation, what have you, simulate on these trajectories to understand if there's a bottleneck upstream, what's it going to do downstream. The very first instance of this and the first use case of that simulation was with breast cancer screening, where we started to show that with breast cancer screening, if the government, because they paused it over COVID, if they waited an additional 1 or 2 months, the impact that that has on breast cancer treatment delays and wait lists is not linear. Like it's not like 1 month of paused breast cancer screening results in 1 month of delays. It results in about a year of delays. So worked with them to ultimately bring that back quicker, because otherwise the aftermath was going to be worse. And this applies now. We're looking at this with regards to in-hospital. If there's a bottleneck in surgery for, let's say, prostate patients, what's that going to do when that bottleneck is cleared? It's going to shoot downstream and then cause a bottleneck in radiation, because radiation now suddenly has this influx of patients that, had they known, they maybe could have done something about. So that's ultimately where this cross-departmental tool can come in. And of course, when you are actually considering the individual patient who receives multiple types of treatment, whether they're concurrent or otherwise, we can make sure that that's actively being looked at as we're doing the scheduling. What I wanted to highlight here, and we got a few questions when I was meeting with a few of you earlier today, is the concept of putting a team together. And anytime, if you're really, regardless of what you're doing, but certainly if you're looking at a startup, making sure that there's a complementary background and skill sets in the team. This starts with the founders, but then extends to who you're bringing on. So myself and Mark are the 2, let's call it full-time founders. We both went through this program. I have more of an interest and, let's say, expertise, although I am a first-time founder, on the business side of things, where Mark is on the technical side. So it's not like we're both trying to do the same thing. And then we also brought on Raphael last year, who is handling operations, and she has a background in pharmacy, which has proven, again, to be very valuable as we start to explore and build software in that realm as well. In terms of advisors, this also really makes up a strong backbone of any, I'll say, team broadly, because it's company, hospital, academic team, what have you. The top 3 are all founders of the company. Jan, of course, used to be the director here and has since moved to Princess Margaret. And then Louis Martin and Nadia are both experts in healthcare logistics and operations research, which ultimately is the type of algorithm that's really driving the software. And the company, as I'll show on the next slide, was really born out of a desire to translate academic research into the clinic, rather than let it sort of sit in papers that get cited, and hopefully make an impact in that way. Since then, we've also brought on 3 more, Jonathan and Manon on the right are both directors of our board as well. They all bring expertise specifically on the American side of things. So in terms of how we got from the PhD to now, a couple of questions I've had are like, how are you able to do this? Which is very fair as to how was I able to work on this together out of a PhD. Serendipity is a lot of it. Right place, right time. I fully acknowledge that there's always a lot of survivorship bias in this type of thing. So I'm making that very clear up front. I wouldn't necessarily say like, hey, you should just go start a company. There needs to be a lot of things that click together at the right place, right time to have a reasonable chance of still being alive for this type of thing. Happy to get into that more. So we really began, it's a bit fuzzy where we began because I was sort of straddling the PhD and the company for the thesis writing portion. But really it started as soon as I finished the PhD and was able to focus full time. And that was right as COVID was hitting. And our first thought was sort of like, okay, we need to go get real jobs because we both have families and hospitals have no time for us. This was before we really had much code at all. But what we found was that hospitals, and specifically the SHIM, who was our first co-development partner where we built it with them, pulled us closer and had more of a desire for software that could help them with the operational challenges that they were in the middle of, but also expecting to be facing through COVID. So that was one of the bittersweet elements of COVID for us. You may have seen there's plenty of other companies that have similar stories for that. This helped us secure our first funds and partner with the SHIM, which ultimately was why we were able to get to where we are now, because it's a lot easier to build software that looks shiny and looks cool in a box, but then when you try and bring it into a clinic, it does not resonate at all. And that's not necessarily because you weren't solving the right problem or anything like that. It's just because there's so much nuance to it and rapport that's necessary to build any level of credibility for people to actually use it, that you're taking a big risk if you're building it in a vacuum. So working with a hospital from the ground up was instrumental in all of this. Most companies, including ours, certainly enterprise software space, it's hard to what's called bootstrap them. That's where you're effectively saying like we can survive off of no external cash, like not bringing in any dilutive financing or selling any other company. We're not able to do that. That was never the plan from the start. So we had to raise external money. We then had an MVP in use, actually at the SHIM, which let us, again, continue to iterate on the feedback loop. Then expanded to the North Shore of Quebec through more government funding. And now we've entered into the Ontario market and have started doing what we're calling paid pilots, essentially, where we're actually convincing a hospital to pay directly for it, which is a key step as we continue to move forward. So currently, we're getting feedback from 4 hospitals overall. A few of them are still ongoing in deployments, and we have a few more on the way. And this really all started from that first opportunity in, I guess it was summer of 2020, where we were able to kind of get the first money to get us off the ground. And in many ways, that is kind of an inflection point where, like, I was saying this earlier, we were maybe 3 weeks away from like quitting because it had gone a few months where of course we hadn't received money, because where would we have received it from? And there's only so long that we could stretch that out. So if I had to provide a piece of advice, what I've certainly heard a lot of people do is they're trying to do this sort of thing on the side where they still have another job. And then often you'll see people, they'll quit and go full time when the means are there. I took it slightly different route where it was kind of like, right, at a PhD, let's jump right into this. And I'm very fortunate that it ended up working, but it doesn't always work. So kind of wanted to highlight that as it's not necessarily what I would recommend. So in terms of some closing learnings and or ramblings, whatever you want to call them, and all of these really in my mind are applicable not only to entrepreneurship, but also just to PhDs, MSCs, what have you. One that has really helped me is don't get bogged down in the magnitude of your goals. Like this is whether it's the company or whether it's finishing my PhD or anything like that. Like there's a huge task ahead of you. Don't worry too much. Like it's super easy to think day to day or week to week, like, man, I didn't, like, what did I do this week? But that's where really reflect on it. And you only have to be moving small steps every week. And instead of looking at those like a failure, look at them like a positive. If it's like, hey, we did this one experiment and invalidated something, or we did this one experiment and invalidated something. We did an experiment, it failed. That's a learning. So think like that. And it really helps with the next step, which is about enjoying the highs and pushing through the lows. Again, this applies to life, PhDs, certainly companies. If you're looking at getting into a startup, even if you're not starting it, if you're an early employee, it's an emotional roller coaster like you've never experienced. So you need to be able to reconcile that and be able to, as I say here, both enjoy the highs and don't just get devastated by the lows, because there are good and bad days. Work hard to maintain work-life balance. This is a bit of a cliche that I don't necessarily do as well as I should. It's always kind of a work in progress. COVID has not, at least for me, has not helped with this. Having 2 years or whatever where your living room was your office doesn't help with any of this, but it is very important. Certainly from a cultural perspective, I have 2 kids. I leave work at 4:30 to pick them up from daycare. That's just what it is. And obviously, like our team sees me do that, and they understand that. And that's kind of a culture that we worked hard to build. And if someone disagrees with it, that's fine. Like, frankly, I wouldn't want you as part of the group anyway. But it requires effort is the main thing I want to focus on here. A big element that I've spoken about a good amount this morning is don't believe that the only future career path is academia or the clinic. This is a common thing that I've heard a lot of people look at. Like when they're talking about, okay, I'm getting this medical physics degree, where am I going next? They really only look at those 2. And I just want to put the seed or help grow the plant in your head that it's really not the only 2 paths. There's a big third one, which is industry. Not necessarily sitting here and advocating, saying, go start a company, but more, whether it's the big fish, Varian, Electa, whatever, they're always looking for smart problem-solving people, which is ultimately what physicists all are, or even the startup scene. Montreal specifically, Toronto, Vancouver are kind of the 3 big ones in Canada, have a huge startup scene. And that means that you have the chance to go see what's out there. And there's a lot of cool, innovative, risky startups that all of you would have the opportunity to be a relatively early employee in. And it's just something worth considering. It's not necessarily advocating for one versus the other. I'm not trying to shut down the other 2 paths. It's just to make it very clear that that third one is there as well. And I wouldn't necessarily recommend starting a company while writing a thesis and raising a toddler. There's never a good time to do certain things, but there's probably better times than others. And it's hindsight is 20/20, but it's hard to say if that was actually the right choice. So that is all I have. As I mentioned before, I told Pete earlier, I was like, I don't know how long this is going to end up being, but happy to kind of get into whatever and answer questions.